you know who we're going to listen to. I want to thank our good friends at Elm Street Books. They are here with copies of Invisible Generals, Rediscovering Family Legacy, and a quest to honor America's first Black general. It's for sale. It makes a great holiday present.
It's the most unbelievable holiday present. I'm serious, this is a divisive year, and the Invisible General brings everyone together.
All right.
So why are we here? Doug Melville is one of today's most innovative and sought-out voices in diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's a celebrated author, a three-time TEDx speaker. He's been featured prominently in the media, including CBS Saturday Morning, Time, The Daily Show, The Guardian, The Breakfast Club, and The Washington Post, and is also a Forbes.com contributor. And he wrote this fabulous book. Ruth Hubbard is the Director of Product Strategy at Fiserv. Beyond her corporate career, Ruth has a strong passion for amplifying underrepresented voices in the business world. Inspired by her involvement with 2045 Studio, a private membership network for influential professionals of color, she dedicates a significant time to moderating insightful conversations with thought leaders, first-time authors, entrepreneurs, and investors. Welcome, Ruth and Doug.
Good evening, everyone. This is good. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for coming today. I know you could be sitting at home waiting for the world to change tomorrow, so I am glad for us to be here today and reflect. We have such a wonderful program set up. This is my second time interviewing Doug. The first time we met a year ago when the book launched, November 7th. And so we have many topics to cover. First, what it's been like the past year, what he's learned on the book tour. Second, how is it connected today and where we are as it relates to society, democracy, how you have impact on the greatest story ever told, the American story. And then lastly, what things should we learn to apply in our own lives and our own story as it relates to honoring our family legacy. So, how does that sound? Awesome. Okay, well, we have an hour, and we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so please save your questions till then. But I'd be remiss without starting and saying that I know we lost Quincy Jones yesterday, and he had a huge impact on Doug. So I want to start there because I think it'll help crystallize the story about who you are and influencing why you created the book you did. So let's start there.
So first I just want to say there is wine and food, so please feel free to get it, because it looks good. As you say, it's for the guests, it's for the company. Actually you hear sometimes these stories of people like they're almost mythical or unrealistic, or they're just fairy tales. But when I was 20 years old, my first internship was under Quincy Jones, and I was his final intern before he shut his record label. I grew up, I was born and raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and my mother, who's actually here tonight, she was teaching at a school with another colleague of hers, and her colleague's son ultimately ended up working for Quincy Jones. And my mother, in one of these stories where she kind of makes you have a forced friend, those things where she's like, you love Norma's children, Doug? And I was like, yes, I love them, and ultimately that introduction provided me the opportunity to work for Quincy Jones. The gentleman ended up getting promoted, and I went out there, and because we had nowhere to stay, I used to sleep on the couch in my grandmother's apartment. And Quincy Jones, I would stay at the office till 11 o'clock and get in at 5 a.m. and he would come in every day and say, you work harder than the people that I pay. But I had nowhere to go. And, interns. But he told me two things, and then we could really go on to the story, but he told me 85% of every decision that directly affects you, you're not in the room to have a voice. And he would always say, Doug, your reputation is the only thing that precedes you. So he would always make me practice my elevator speech. What do people say about me when I leave a room? Repeating something 3 times so people associate that word with you. And the other thing he said was, Doug, a third of your life you spent working in an office, a third of your life you spend sleeping, but that last third is what separates greatness from failure. And I always thought about these things because when you work for someone like that and you're so young, it has to be theory that you follow. But when he passed today, there was so many text chains, and his son and other family members, and everybody was just so active, and he touched so many people's lives. So there is a chapter in the book about this story, but I think it was just fitting that there was something happening today.
Absolutely. Well, with that said, let's get back to the book. We're a year out from the launch, November 7th, 2023, and I want to know what you learned in the past year on this book tour, because we're speaking to a range of people here. We have veterans in the room, we have family members of veterans, we have book lovers, and I want to crystallize kind of how that story could impact each one of these people here.
So I just kind of want to take you back to the origin story, because I want to, if I can, have you take away one thing from today is inspire you to write your own story, inspire you to write it down, inspire you to research it. Growing up in Connecticut, we knew, of course, Ben Davis Jr. He was a famous military man, but to me, he was just like the older guy in the family that would pay for my college or like buy me golf clubs. You know how you have like a mystery older person that just seems to always be very helpful when you need them the most? And when I went to go see the movie Red Tails in 2012, Ben Davis Jr. was the main character, and he was played by Terrence Howard. But when the movie started, the names were changed by the Hollywood studio to not pay the family royalties. And when I went home to talk to my dad about it, he goes, Doug, you can't complain about something and fix something at the same time. If you don't think this is right, go out and do something about it. But there's two things I want you to keep in mind. Talking about race and history is divisive, so it may not actually work well for you in your career. And second of all, if you think taking the name out of the movie is bad, let me tell you the story of Ben and his father. They were known in the military as the Invisible Generals. These two men raised my dad. So he then tells me this whole story. I had never written a book. I never thought it would become a book. It just was an itch that I was just more curious to find out. And I started going to online, and I started finding little things here and little things there, and started to realize that these two men did so much. But it was actually Archie Elam, who's sitting here in the front row. I was introduced to him because West Point was considering naming a barracks after one of 3 graduates of West Point. And it was William Westmoreland, it was Norman Schwarzkopf, and it was Benjamin Davis. And they had put him there almost as a diversity hire, that they needed to show some diversity in the opportunity of this building being renamed. And Archie moved everyone out of the way so I could have my kind of Sermon on the Mount speech at West Point. And I didn't know how that was going to turn out, because West Point's not really soft and it doesn't really care about soft skills so much. But they welcomed me in with open arms, and ultimately in 2017 we cut the ribbon on the Davis Barracks, which was $100 million, the largest barracks, the tallest barracks on the whole campus. And once that happened, the historian from West Point said, "Let me help you." The historian from the Air Force Academy said, "Let me help you." Then people started coming out of the woodworks going, "Oh, I have a story about Ben Davis. Oh, I have a story of my grandfather. Oh, have you watched this video? Oh, have you seen this stanza from a book?" And over the course of 10 years, the book came together, and I was telling it at dinner parties, telling people about the story, and a friend of mine was like, "Doug, you should write this into a book." And I was telling Charlemagne the God the story. We were at an event together, and he goes, "I have a publishing arm with Simon & Schuster. I want to be the one that brings this story to life." And Charlemagne the God, who you would really, he's the Breakfast Club and all the things, we know the God's in his name. I don't know what's happening, but what I know is it's positive energy. And he was the one who took the story, brought it to Simon & Schuster, and made sure that it got the advance and the proper billing so it could become the next great American story. And the thing he liked about it was there's so few stories about fathers and sons. And two men who were the first two black generals in the military. At the start of World War II, 335,000 people in the military and only two black officers, a father and a son. And the fact that that story had not been told. So in the past year, people have written me letters from all over the world. People have stopped me. People have just shared so much about what this story meant, particularly fathers, sons, people in the military. And I think that was my biggest learning, was how much a story actually can bring people together, and how much people really want to hear about family history, and how important it is for us to actually go out and find our stories if they're not already readily available in the world. General Logan, thank you. Phone a friend, phone a friend.
Your friends are here.
I'm like, General who? Yes, Logan, it's participation. But General Logan brought him in, and General Logan's best friend was Ulysses S. Grant. So because Ulysses S. Grant and General Logan befriended Lewis Davis because he was their babysitter of their oldest child, they actually started to do favors for him. They put a deposit on his house so he could be a real estate owner. They made sure no one ever had any violence against him. So Lewis Davis was actually protected in Washington, D.C. So he had a son, and his son wanted to be in the military, but they didn't want to get in the habit of allowing blacks into West Point. So President McKinley rejected the application, and Ben Sr. ran away to join the Buffalo Soldiers. And when he was at the Buffalo Soldiers, he met a West Point grad named Charles Young. And Charles Young had graduated West Point and told Ben Sr. how he could get his son in there, but he would have to start now. So Ben Sr. ends up having two daughters and a son, and his wife dies in childbirth, and now he's a single father. And his son was depressed, and he wanted to, make him happy, so his son asked if he could go barnstorming and fly an airplane. And when they came down from barnstorming, he goes, "Daddy, I want to be a pilot." And at the time, aviation wasn't even 20 years old. It was 100% segregated. And he goes, "If you want to be a pilot, there's one way to do it. You have to graduate from West Point." And from the time he was 7, every day they woke up at the same time. Workout, calisthenics. You think now, Shedeur Sanders or LeBron, his son, and it's like he dedicated his whole life so his son could get into West Point when he wasn't able to get in. So his son gets into West Point. His wife is unable to have children, so they raise my dad, who's their oldest nephew, as their son. And my dad moves down to Tuskegee, Alabama, and his babysitter is, George Washington Carver. And my dad tells me stories that are so ancient that I can't believe my dad's babysitter was George Washington Carver. It's like, "Yo, Dad, how old are you, bro? Seriously. Did you try peanut butter for anybody else?" Or no? So, but the thing about it was, my dad was down there, and then he raised me and never told me the story until 2012. So this is how this family story kind of came to be, but it also shows that there were successful black families in the 1800s and the early 1900s. There wasn't many of them, but the condition was the presidents would protect them. And one of the things I just wanted to share is that, they make a movie called The Help about the black people that worked in the White House. But what they don't make a movie about is that this father and son worked directly under 8 different presidents of the United States of America as the highest ranking black senior advisor. And no one's ever heard of them. And when you start to read about this, and when you go to the presidential libraries, and when you go to Smithsonian, during the COVID, a lot of the pictures weren't scanned. So the museum policy in the 70s and the 80s was they were only tagging white male names. So there would be photos, President Carter and others, President Roosevelt and others. And it took 8 years of me going back to the museums and re-tagging all these photos so they were included. But this is how I know that there's so many other stories out there, because if you're not going to put in that work, you're not going to really uncover the tapestry of American history.
So powerful, and there's so many things that you said that I want to jump back to before we move forward. So I think the first thing is, as it relates to the origin story and the connection to Veterans Day coming up, and some of the things that you learned that have been surprising along the way. You've highlighted a few stats already, but I think one of the things that would be helpful for everyone to understand now is the recognition journey, even in your own process, was difficult, let alone what we just heard some of the snippets about what was done to Benjamin, senior and junior. So it'd be great if you could highlight that and what it's been like the past year.
Yeah, I mean, the last year, once we got West Point to, really align with us, the Air Force Academy named their airport after them. 13 schools and public schools districts have been renamed after Ben. So I've really taken this opportunity to just make sure that he doesn't disappear. In the last year, though, the first interview that I did was on The Daily Show, and Charlemagne the God just coincidentally was hosting that episode, and he was able to pick his last guest that week. And I remember they called me the day before and go, Doug, we got you on The Daily Show. And I said, wait, is there like an internet edition or something? They're like, is it .com? And then where do you find it? And they're like, Doug, The Desk. And I was like, The Desk. And I was like, let me go to Macy's, it's like. So I arrived at The Daily Show, and they're like, this is your dressing room. And to go on The Daily Show to share my family story for Veterans Day last year was like the most amazing honor. And then that led to one thing after another after another. And I think my biggest learning was that the veterans in America are young and hip, and they look like everybody, and they are everybody. And I think before this process, I felt like they were, the man at the parade with the hat on, that's like, hello, and those people too, but, there's so many veterans, and I think that as a diversity officer, because I switched my career once this process started, I was the president of Magic Johnson's company, and I left LA and became a diversity officer to help companies, ensure that people weren't overlooked. One of the things I really learned in the process was, how many things we can actually control and how many things we could actually have a perspective on, because we have to be the ones that make this change. And we talk about diversity with every issue going up and down, but we never talk about veterans. We don't really talk about people with mobility issues and accessibility. We turn on race and LGBT and, and gender, which is important, but we do not really mention veterans enough. And we do not mention people in wheelchairs enough. And everyone's going to have a disability one day, and the veteran count is by the millions. And there's so much we could do, and I think that's really what I learned last Veterans Day was all the different things that we could do to support our veterans around the country, and that we just don't have visibility to.
That's a powerful point, and I think one of the things that you touched on that I'd like to dive deeper into is the corporate versions in terms of what's set up in terms of resources, benefits, things that are neglected when we think about it from a mainstream perspective and then in a business context, because there's different levers and things that you can control when you're in a private sector versus public sector. And I think it'd be interesting for people to understand one, the leadership aspect that comes from that, which is why veterans are obviously sought after and hired everywhere. But two, considering how much their leadership is valued, why it's not showing up in the way they're either compensated for the things that they do, or how Ben Senior wasn't compensated in terms of later in life. So it'd be interesting if you could thread the needle there. That'd be helpful.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges with individuals who've been in the military is that most of them are humble, and we live in a world where everybody's fighting to be the loudest. So culturally, there's just differences. People do the work and they come home and they go, I did the work. And we live in a world now where everybody's like, look at me, stare at me, look at me. It's like, so that's the brand perception of veterans is in line with their duty and honor and country, but it's not in line with social narratives. And I think that's kind of one thing that's limiting this conversation. Talking about challenges of diversity in corporations, I think in some ways big corporations today are parallel to the military. At the start of World War II, the United States military was the largest company in the world if it was a corporation. But the thing about it is, it was hard for me to understand, Ruthie, and for everybody in here, all these World War II stories you hear growing up, that the military was 100% segregated. You know, like, it wasn't really, I didn't really understand it because the way they tell these stories on TV, you just don't really notice it. And when World War II was starting, FDR wanted to win re-election, so he hires Ben Sr., the father, to be the head of Negro policy. And the first thing he was tasked to do, oh yeah, I have some props over here, like a comic book that they were made, or them on ebony. I picked up a lot of different things. I figured I was at a library, so I would bring library things. What's a library thing? I don't know, magazines, books. But Ben Sr. was brought on as an advisor to FDR to win the black vote. And I think one thing that I learned when I see how politics has become so racially targeted, I mean, you can't turn on TV and be like, Asian people over 25, black people that have, you know, one bad eye. You know, like, I feel like they have just like everything is about race, or like, you know, there's nothing that's like about any other thing. And 90% of every black in America was voting Republican up to FDR's election. And when FDR wanted to get elected for the third time, he brings on Ben Davis Sr., who he promoted to general on October 25th before the election. Just so I could just, every single promotion they got was a month before the election. So every single promotion, you know, that was a big learning for me, because they should have gotten it before, but they didn't. But it was really all to win the black vote. And when FDR says, well, if you want blacks to be treated fairly, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to create a black flying unit. And he said, well, who would lead that? And he said, my son. And this is when his dad was on the signature to create the flying program for black individuals to, what was it called, Archie? The civilian flying program? The civilian relief air fleet. So you gotta have a fact checker. I'm just saying, they're all over Stanford, they're everywhere. But that was an important. Here's Ben and his dad when Ben Jr. got into West Point and ended up graduating. This is General Pershing, who wasn't gonna shake his hand before graduation because of Ben's race. Tuskegee Airmen, and I think what's really important to understand about that, never commanded anybody before in battle. Now he's in charge of 15,000 people. In order for this to fail, the military passed a rule that if a part worked on an airplane of a white piloted plane, it could not be used by the Tuskegee Airmen. So every replacement part, every wrench, every screwdriver, every plate, every food delivery company, everything had to be segregated. So Ben had to create this entire ecosystem. And then when they get across overseas, he realizes that the maps that he's getting are segregated. So because he's the only black airfield, he's getting maps with just his airbase on it. And he's calling in and they're letting him know, because the military is segregated, he's getting the black map and the white map, and so are other leaders in Europe. So he said, let's paint the tails red so no one bombs us. And that was the beginning of the red tails. And that's why the tails of the planes were painted red. So the fact that this was all happening and never really being documented was just like a tragedy of American history, you know, as we sit in this library. But I think it's important to understand this was only 5 minutes ago. My dad's babysitter invented peanut butter. So it's like, you know, the 1945, you know, it's getting farther away, but it's not that far away.
Yes, you hit us with a few bombs there, so I want to
Yeah.
get
It's a big story. It's a big
Yes,
story.
exactly.
The key to writing a good book is a Doug editor. Editor, Doug, editor. I was like, what about that story? They go, editor, Doug.
All right, well, the first thing is being set up to fail, I think was something that stood out and is applicable to where we are today. And so that is something that I want to unpack as it relates to what you just went through. Some of those sound bites, I think, are like so powerful because we need to be reminded that these things actually happen to them and are continuing to happen.
We're not making it up.
Right.
You know, when I started this process, historians were like, no, this can't be, this can't be. And then they would find it, and then they would find the sources of it. And over the course of time, even Simon & Schuster was like, okay, how could all this happen to one guy? But we sourced every single thing, and it's all real. You know, and the thing about it was, it just wasn't tagged.
Right.
You know, and it's a very small thing, but it's very influential. But if it's not for people like Archie along the way, if it's not for my dad, you know, finally being open to the story, if it's not for the Air Force Academy, you know, just beautiful people that wrote me letters out of the blue, you know, the story doesn't come together. And I think believing in people wanting to tell the story is something that's important, but also realizing we're not making it up. It's not crazy. People really were given nothing because of their race. And Ben Jr.'s dad, Ben Sr., who was America's first black general, in his diary he would write, imagine every day for 50 years, every room you walk in, you get the worst of everything. No food you don't eat, no chair you don't sit, leaky room, you get that. Every single room for 50 years, the worst everything. It's just hard to believe people did that. You know, and I'm complaining that, you know, the crab is not real in the crab cave. You know, what kind of ice is this? I'm not in a hospital. Like, you know, don't you have a real cube? You know, I'm really that guy. You know, and I'm really, you know, I had to come a long way. What do you mean plastic silverware? You know, like, you have to put yourself and check yourself.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think with that said, in terms of some of the surprising reactions I'm sure you've had over the year, is there anything that stood out the most in terms of some of the responses, whether it's from hearing snippets from his diary or from just interactions? You've done several interviews. You started writing for Forbes as well, which I think is an interesting connection just to tell more of these stories as it relates to current events. So it'd be great if you could.
Yeah. So I think, and I actually have a visual of this and I want to show you. What was very interesting to me was, this is Ben Sr., his father, and I had a long conversation with the Truman Library. Please don't show video of the Truman Library. I love the Truman Library. They're my favorite of all the libraries after this one. And after this one, I don't need your come with me. Of all the libraries, this one, then the Truman Library. And what I think is important is I went to there was something called Executive Order 9981 that just turned 75 last year, and it was the 75th anniversary of the Air Force and the 75th anniversary of an executive order signed by President Truman to integrate the military, provide equal pay regardless of race and gender, and ensure that no one was discriminated against through policy. And there was this video on the internet, and it always looked like Ben Sr. was so aggravated when he retired. And this is July 14th, 1948, and Ben Sr. just looked so upset in this photo. And when I ended up researching, what I found was Ben Sr. actually wrote Executive Order 9981, and he was supposed to release it with Truman on July 26, 1948. but Truman forced him to retire on July 14th and removed his name from not only the document, he wasn't allowed to sign the order, he wrote the order because he was the only person who had lived through 50 years of the integrated military. So in theory, no one would even know what they needed to offer because there was no one on the other side of the experience. And Truman forced him to retire to remove his name and likeness from Executive Order 9981. And you know, when you talk to the Truman Library, they'll tell you, well, that's not what we fundraise off of. And I'm just telling you the truth. I mean, these conversations with people, because there's narratives that exist that people live on, that pays their rent, that provides donations. So when you come, people are immediately, not all people, but some people are very standoffish because they believe you're trying to ruin their story or you're trying to get in where they're getting in. But the reality is it's all written down. It's just what we choose to highlight. And I think that was the biggest learning for me. And then also, Ben Davis Sr., that was the father, but Ben Davis Jr. was supposed to get his 4th star by LBJ in 1967. And LBJ pulls him into the Oval Office and tells him, and this news clip is actually titled, America's First Negro 4-Star General, with a question mark because the announcement was supposed to come out of the White House. And LBJ pulled him in and said, I've already done enough to win the black vote. I've already put Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court. I already passed Martin Luther King's agenda. There's no more political gain by promoting you to 4-star general. So I can just imagine as that you've lived this whole life, and at the end of the day, you just have to eat it. And the aviation industry was segregated. So when he tried to get a pilot job, FedEx had just started. He begged to fly a cargo plane. They said no. He tried to fly for United, Pan Am, American, Delta, all the airlines, not Spirit. No, I'm just kidding. He did not want to fly for Spirit. I just want to make sure we're clear. No one wants to fly Spirit.
This is.
But yeah, anyway, but just to tell you, like, it was one thing after another that they had to deal with, and all I knew was the guy that provided me a Honda Accord as my first car, 4-door white, and then my brother intercepted it. And he got me these golf clubs, real woods, Doug. These are the real golf clubs. I was like, man, Ben, I'm the only one with real wood clubs out here on this golf course. You know, but I knew him as that, and to go back and research this, to think of no complaining. The guy never complained about anything. He would wake up, toast be burnt, better than nothing. Water's brown, could be dehydrated. You know, like this guy was like, I was like, what? I used to say to my dad and mom, what's wrong with him? How can anyone be this positive? But he was like almost bulletproof to the system. And that's what I think we can learn, because I called the editor of Forbes and I said, why are all the articles about diversity negative? And they were like, well, if you want a positive article, write it. And I was like, oh, okay, this is like at a nonprofit when you're like voluntold, you have to bring the cookies, you know. I was like, I didn't want to write it, I just wanted to complain. But, you know, that was actually how the conversation started, and I think it's important that we realize people are waiting for us to raise our hand and do something, but we're just not always listening to the signals.
Okay, there's 2 things that he said that I want to get into. First is the 4-star general in that. Mm-hmm. And I would love if you could quantify the math exactly of like what that meant from a retirement perspective, in terms of the difference between a 3-star general and a 4-star general, so everybody's clear about what that meant, the impact on his retirement and therefore his family. Mm-hmm. And then we'll get into the next part around doing something positive when we were originally complaining.
Yeah. I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm going through the story and I'm like, okay, so then what? They forced the guy to retire, and what does he do? Well, he can't get a job, and the presidential administration at the time didn't want him to be unemployed because it was going to look bad for the black vote. And you know, I was telling Ruthie today, I said, you know, can I tell them? Ruthie's like, Doug, we're not going to talk about this. But Ben Davis Jr. and and Ben Davis Sr. never voted. And the reason they never voted is because they were the only two blacks, and they felt no matter who they voted for, it would actually be used against them when it came time to be promoted. So they made an agreement to never speak of it and never vote. And I thought, what an interesting scenario, you know, and sometimes you look back at history and sometimes it's like non sequiturs, it doesn't even make sense. But the fact that these two men never voted because it was weaponized, you know, everything they did, they were living in, fear of waking up for breakfast, you know what I mean? So, but Ben went on, and because they couldn't find him a job, they gave him a job in the Department of Transportation, Aviation, and there he created the TSA. So Ben Davis, every time you're mad at the TSA, I was like, you know what, I went to this talk in Stanford, and this guy was like, my family made that thing. So I just want to let you know, I'm sorry, but this guy is the reason why you gotta take your shoes and water out. But this is actually him walking through the first airport security in 1971. Before that, there was only airport security in 3 airports in Washington, D.C. But there was a lot of hijacking, so he created the United States Air Marshal Program. He created the doors on the airplanes that lock, when you take off. He didn't get any money for that. And then in 1974, he did so well, Carter asked him if he could do the same for road transportation. He created a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. So it's another thing he did that makes you upset. But, the guy can't play a perfect game. So in 1998, President Clinton called our family and said they wanted to retroactively promote Ben Davis Jr. to 4-star general in retirement. And there's a whole chapter in the book about this. It's called The $1 Million Star. And I would love if you all picked up a book to really read the story. The book tested well, so scientists used to love to put pictures in it, which is really the part you look at anyway. We only go look at the pictures in the book, so it's like, we get pictures? Okay now, all right. So I talk about how Ben was going to get the 4-star from President Clinton. It was actually John McCain had lobbied for 12 years to get the 4th star. And finally, President Clinton agreed to do it under 2 conditions. It had to be done during the Monica Lewinsky impeachment trial. Guys, I'm telling you, this story keeps on giving. It is rich, it is rich. But according to the editors, allegedly that was supposed to happen. And the other condition was we were not going to be able to receive any financial benefit for the star. And I think that was the part where Ben Jr. had told his dad he wanted to be a general. He had promised his dad, he had been denied it in 1967. Here I am in 1998, and we all get down to the White House, and the night before the event, there's a whole argument breaks out in the House because Ben's wife, Agatha, of 62 years, refuses to go if we're not going to get compensated. How could the President of the United States of America invite us to the White House to get an honor that you are acknowledging we didn't get, only under the condition that we don't get paid for the 31 years back or the 4 years forward? So it was a total of 35 years, and it was over $1.3 million. And the night before, Agatha refuses to go, and Ben just sat there and said, what difference does it make? And he goes to the White House that day, and my mom wrote his speech, but he was getting Alzheimer's. So when he gets up on stage, he goes, I had no idea what I was doing today. And I remember the whole family looked and was like, oh my gosh, he finally got the moment he worked his whole life for, and he's having like a memory lapse where he actually, and if you ever watch this video, it's so amazing. He goes, I don't know how it is I woke up today and had no idea what was going on, and we were like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And this is when President Clinton pinned on his 4th star And I would like to give Ben Davis a Presidential Medal of Freedom. I do think the military and the veterans, for anybody who wants to like help me put together the coalition, should not give people promotions and not pay them financially. And it happens only to women, people of color, and LGBT, because what they're doing is they're giving social promotions for social conditions that were in the past that were under the gaze of the military or the American government. So the only three groups that are getting these promotions are these groups of people, and they have to sign a piece of paper that says it's only honorary. And you have to forego the money back and forward. And I just don't see with this, all the money we spend on who knows what, would it kill you to give the families, you know, this, it's not really a lot of money in perspective. But we did get the 4th star, and Ben would end up dying on the 4th of July in 2002. And he requested a black tombstone in Arlington. And there's 3 black tombstones in Arlington National Cemetery. There's Thurgood Marshall was the first one to request a black tombstone. There was another general who worked in the early 1930s. He requested one. And the third was Ben Davis Jr. And he requested a black tombstone on a hill overlooking all the people that overlooked him in life and death. And after he got his tombstone, Arlington stopped allowing black tombstones because Colin Powell wanted one and he was denied. Yeah, so this whole story was just like, man, it's just so rich and so deep, and it's so relevant to today for everything that we're going through, for the conversation around diversity, representation, what is fair, what is the role in society for our ancestors' work. You know, if you got a house 75 years ago for $2,000, you know, that changed your whole family's fortune. So we could say that it doesn't matter, but it does matter, that's the thing.
Absolutely, that was crystal clear, and I think one of the things that you said there that we should be thinking about in terms of looking forward is what that means for everybody here. So in terms of the actions that they can take when they think about the things that they're either prioritizing in their own lives, and you like starting to write after complaining, and you ended up getting beaten Forbes. Can you give us some inspiration for things that people can do that may be helpful in terms of, you hear this story today, you're obviously affected because it's incredible, but what are some of the things that, they should look at going forward, especially with all the voters here?
Yeah, we should definitely vote. Right. We should definitely vote. 100% we should vote. I think we should, also Jackie Robinson's wife lives in Stamford still, right? Rachel Robinson.
She's not here, she's back in New York, she's like 101.
Yeah. But I was just going to say just the history of Connecticut and everything. There's a lot of people here that did great work that, you may not know. So I would say because we're approaching Veterans Day and we're approaching an election, obviously volunteer, give your time, donate to a library, all those things. I think you should vote because, of course that's our civic duty. I think they were living in a unique time when everything was like suspect. I think the other thing we should do, read to veterans, donate to veterans, books, time, money. There's VFWs, there's associations of graduates. This gentleman here has an organization with 150 members for retired veterans. So I think learning that Memorial Day was to memorialize those that didn't make it through the war, and Veterans Day was to honor those that lived, made me realize the value that we should be putting in Veterans Day. Like, you made it back home, so we really should do something. The VA does things, but I think the same way that we go out to the club or we support the ballet. I love the ballet. I'm just saying everyone loves ballet, but we don't do the same for the veterans. Is all I'm saying. I'm just from a place of gratitude. If we don't serve, we're affected by them, and our lives are shaped by them. So I think we should take the time to be aware of them and participate, wherever we can, doing something.
Right.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for your service. All the veterans here too. We should do that West Wing, oldest and youngest. Are there any veterans here that can stand up, just if we don't mind? I mean, if you can't stand, you can raise a hat. Yes, the veterans, thank you so much. This is so important. This is so important. Thank you so much.
Okay.
You know, we do it on time. Is the wine still good? Asking for
45 minutes out of 60.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
We always get the military time. I said it's time.
Well, before I get to Q&A, I just want to sum up some of the things we talked about and then open the floor.
Yeah, any questions? You know, you can go wide, whatever works.
But there were 3 key themes that I think you covered that I wanted to reiterate to the group. So first, in terms of mentorship and inspiration for the story, I think that was so powerful. Unfortunately, timely, didn't see past yesterday, but the idea of, you know, his career obviously influencing culture, everything we know, and then your ability to tell your own story is something that I think everyone should take away. I think the second thing as it relates to how we look at veterans and their role and contributions and how they should be integrated into spaces post their service life is something that we can all think about as it relates to the leadership positions that they're in today, the spaces that they occupy, the way they should be honored differently, the benefits and things like that are something that I know I've learned for the first time last year and found to be so impressive. And I'm going to be in the New York Veterans Day Parade with my company next week. So first time I get to march in that, so I'm very excited to pass the story along to them as well. And then lastly, where we are today in terms of moving the country forward, that is ultimately what both Bens are trying to do. That's what you're doing by telling this story. I thank you for doing that. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you for helping put this together too.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we should all remember.
Yeah. And thank you all, you know, for taking the time tonight and coming. I think it's just so important. And Ben really had 3 sayings he gave me, so we can maybe take these with us too before we do Q&A. The first was, you have to use the system to diffuse the system. You can only do so much from an outside position. You can only yell, you can only point, you can only complain so much. But the real change happens with people within a model. So sometimes you don't get the best seat, but if you have to look at the system that you want to change, you can't complain about it and fix it at the same time. So that was number 1. Cultural competency is a superpower. Ben had to know everything about, you know, how white soldiers worked and different, you know, Italians and Jewish soldiers, because everybody was clicked up, but nobody ever took the time to learn about black soldiers. And that was a blind spot. And he always wanted me to travel. I wrote most of my book in Switzerland. I lived in Geneva the last 3 years. I wrote it in Amsterdam. I traveled to all the places Ben was. Ramatelli, Italy, which has a shrine, you know, different places. So I think cultural competency and just getting out there and traveling. And the third thing was, the impossible takes time, but in time you can accomplish the impossible. And I think my contribution to my family story is being able to be the megaphone so the world can understand it. And maybe that's our place. You know, like we have social media, we have computers, we have video. Maybe our story is the ability to tell our family story. And maybe that's really our purpose in this moment in time where we're here.